there's a great issue at the heart of culture, which is that the human being is being transfigured by forces, and culture necessarily retains the human in an animal system. And the animal system is a semiotic system, which is a system of symbolic behaviors which are understood by a community or by a group. This is a primal mechanism of mutual understanding and mutual comprehension, which is profoundly, fundamentally implicit and explicit in language and in any linguistic work. And so this is the issue in which the human being is couched, is that it is contained once in a biological container and twice in a cultural container. And I've spoken about this extensively in my deeper, more fundamental, abstract, metaphysical and philosophical and psychological work and scientific work, is to say that the human being as a construct is limited by its acquiescence to the mass drive, which is again, the turning of the human being into a symbolic register of symbols and signs toward comprehension by the mass or by the group or by the community or the culture. So this is effectively the entirety of human history, that the human being itself resides within humanity. And this is so profound because it gets us back to the existential physics, or the existential theoretical physics of being human and the experience, where and I've used the term escape velocity before, and I'll use it again, in a hyperdrive existential sense, is that the human being is seeking to overcome itself, but in doing so, right, necessarily there's multiple parts of self-overcoming that are implicit and explicit in that engagement. There's the ancestral history, the cultural history, the human history, the biological history, right? And that itself being, from a very early point in the registration of the human being as the cultivation of an individual, is the creation of a symbolic order and a system in which the human being is necessarily couched. And here we're talking about everything from identity to the linguistic modifiers which the human being applies to space and time, which is its world register, the way in which it perceives world and perceives self. These are the constructs which are cemented into the human being worldview or the human being cosmology, which necessarily is a delusion and is a limitation, but at the same time is what allows for the most primal human drives of connection and understanding and community to emerge into a practical relationship. So there again is this push and pull between the unreality, which is at the depths of the human experience, which is the unreality of a consensus community architecture, right? An insulated symbolic realm which is not oriented towards truth, but instead is oriented towards communal understanding or the communal register of information. And this drag can be most concretely symbolized scientifically in the understanding of intelligence, as in the synaptic nervous system, and the way that the synaptic nervous system fires and creates associative constructs and networks of meaning and information within the human organism as an individual, right? This is the biotectonic architecture of the human being, which again refers us back directly to the stellar nucleosynthesis of stars themselves, and of course the energetic exchange and the thermonuclear metabolic exchange down through scales into the human being proper, which creates its architecture, which is to say its system components and how those system components register reality in the human experience, and thus archetypally and symbolically organize it. So we're talking about orders of information and how that information is interpreted, and this is the whole groundswell of Kant and the Kantian work on judgment and interpretation, which interestingly enough Susan Sontag picks up at the latter part of the 20th century to discuss a movement away from interpretation, because we're looking into the experience of the looking glass eye, the register of the human being, as a way of surmounting itself into a real apperception and proprioception of reality, which here means a real resonance, right? A coming into being, a total presence, a total emergence and submergence into the truth of being, which necessarily is superhuman again, right? So we're looking at this dialectic. And on one pole of that dialectic is the biocultural, which is the hazard of being in form, which is the communal construct which gratifies the deepest biochemical and hormonal instincts of the human being toward community, which is an architecture of communal understanding, which is implicit and explicit in linguistics and symbolic orders. And of course, that symbolic order in the cultural sense is always already a symbolic order built around the human language, the human being language, which is to say the biochemical language and the hormonal order of how the human being is organized towards survival and reproduction, and perceiving the world as in a utility toward the survival and perpetual emergence of the human species and the human race. And then on the other end of that dialectical pole is radical truth, which is an abolition, but at the same time a deeper descent into the true reality, the existential reality beneath and beyond the human archetype, as in the true energetic form beyond the figuration of the human letter as a word in the geological ecosystem of Earth, but also in a cosmological sense. And that word or that letter is composed by a genetic construct which is always already in perennial renovation or reconstruction or recapitulation or recombination. So this is the essential conflict of being human. And this is the work that genius is and does, is that it is a permanent abolition toward a direct encounter with being itself, which is necessarily pre-linguistic, which means it's pre-cultural and pre-biological. When we are discussing the term pre-linguistic, we are talking about before the genome. We're also talking about before space-time. But again, we're also talking about before the cultural construct of the English language or Sanskrit, right? We're talking about before the emergence of the symbolic representational identity as in image making, as a device of reflection or refraction upon the condition of existence, which is to say the advent of the forebrain in specifically bioevolutionary terms and the synaptic register there. We're talking about a return and recedence as in residence into pure presence as a pre-archetypal and post-archetypal in the sense that the symbolic language or register of being in time as in a formal existence is abolished and the total existential condition is met through the form as in a return to the formless. And this is necessarily, again, this is the escape velocity of genius as a neurosynaptic architecture of the experience of being human, which is necessarily transcendental and shatters the cultural ceiling of the historical God, which is to say the precedent upon which humanity is built, and fires into as an absolute limit of its cognition, its perception, and its ability to retain and absorb a grand cosmological or psychological presence of being, the ability to, within to time, emerge the timeless. And this is historically the contraction, the push-pull, and the tension of the architecture and archetype of historical genius in space-time and through human history and human culture as something that necessarily transcends the human experience while articulating what is beneath and beyond the human experience, from above and below. Because this is the architecture of the quantum mechanical abyss, or a black hole physics, both in front of and behind the human experience, which is the void, which is perceived primordially into and through the construction of space-time as the slow linguistic winding as an accumulating sentence structure of the genome, or of the solar system, or of the intergalactic relationship of cosmic energy through the stellar forges of nuclear synthesis. We're reaching back through time and reaching forward into time to receive the couched timelessness within the first and last moment of the universal architecture, which is the appearance of form, which is the perception of a structure, which then life submerges and is submerged into, and has this lived, felt experience of this present architecture, which is in actuality, in a deep time, glacial space-time sense, the cosmological and psychic primordial, absolutely, in terms of their absolute unity, which is to say the absolution of form, and this is how we understand the psyche in terms of dreams. It is first, prior to images, the blackness. And again, this is in direct reference to the cosmological circumstances of the creation of this universe, as well as, again, the full cosmology, which is the population of structures in space-time, which are all necessarily temporal half-lives, and all of which themselves are symbolic representational registers, as in linguistic, as in languages, as in subjects within the field of being, as in space-time, as an appearance. And so this is the conflict of being human, because if you understand in the sense of genius, there is a highly developed psychotropic mind, and psychotrophic as in a hypertrophic mind, which through the psyche is perceiving beyond degrees of the possibility of registering and thus creating domain for, bringing linguistic gravity into that which henceforth has not yet existed or has not had symbolic register or idiom for in the previous human cultural architecture of meaning and being, which is the grand civilizational, right, super civilizational, as in the human species, attempt to create a real construct, a real linguistic construct, which will reflect or refract back the total cosmological identity, the total psychological identity of existence itself proper. This is the human project. But this is the slow integration and psychic metabolism of the human species itself proper historically, when genius must be metabolized in a, we'll call it a post-mortem framework of the idea and the ideal, because it is an initiation into a broader realization than the current metabolic framework of the civilization or the culture or the spirit of the time can hold. This is historically the work of genius from Galileo to Socrates. And this genius itself is just representative, as in the most explicit or fundamental or high contrast, as we discussed previously, chiaroscuratic example of the larger human condition and circumstance, because of its extremity, because of its far-reaching totem. This is the creation of a symbolic register, and when I say totem, I mean the object idea, the object form of the transcendental, being inserted into cultural consciousness and the cultural cognitive architecture of the species itself, as the emergence of a transcendental force which necessarily breaks the glass ceiling of the cultural and symbolic civilizational architecture at large and expands it into a previous abyss, which is necessarily the natural terror of a communal tribal environment experiencing an extension of its linguistic and symbolic order into the earth-shattering hypertrophic framework of genius itself, which necessarily ushers in new symbolic orders, new paradigms of symbolic orders, because this is a symbolic metabolism of existence itself, and this is the purpose of cultural language. This in many ways is also the purpose of the human body as a symbolic architecture and as a form through which being and existence itself metabolizes. Because this is an energetic flux, as in the increasing gravitational constructs and densities of the constructions of waveforms through the perennial universal digestion of stellar nucleosynthesis down through symbolic orders and chains of information creation, construction, consumption, and production, which, as we discussed in the last essay here, the last oration, is that it is a lossy state, an increasingly lossy state from the lossless architecture of being itself, which is the full fulmigation, which is necessarily transcendental of the word, prior to the word, but manifest in the word, down through stages of translation, much as culturally the translation from Sanskrit to English is going to inhabit a certain lossy state of the full spectrum of the effulgence of the linguistic information being communicated within the prior symbolic order. The closer to the origin you get, both in a cosmological and a psychic sense, the more lossless the information is in terms of the communication of that direct effulgent source in a first order symbolic architecture, as opposed to a second or third or fourth order, which is a descendants or an ancestry. Again, this refers directly to Darwin's genealogy of being, and the human being or the species, is that this symbolic order is an ancestral descent down into time, which is a increasing into density and thus decreasing of the effulgence of the waveform presentation as a direct immediacy, which is the revelation of being itself proper. Which is to say, the thermonuclear radiation of the sun is stepping down into higher density, gravitationally pulled, just strictly speaking, thicker resonance machines, resonance systems, which are waveform systems which hold a density as chambers of that fundamental information, which are continually recapitulating and reprocessing that fundamental information as itself the radiation. But themselves, again, have stepped down so thoroughly and so beneath into the symbolic order. This is like a descent into a cave, so to speak. That they have stepped down so thoroughly in that descent into that symbolic order that they are now effectively speaking a different language, which is necessarily always already in reference to the primordial effulgence of being itself proper, but is in a lossy state. So this is what we're talking about in the contractive, constrictive, and even productive tension of genius in relation to culture and the sphere of the biome, the biosphere. Because we're talking about genius as an emergent effulgence from within that cosmic cognitive architecture of the human being, which is a lossy file, as in a space-time gravitational, deep genetic ancestral file of this primal information as a linguistic construct of the animal of millions of years, again, the hindbrain and the forebrain and the neurosynaptic architecture of the human being. But that genius is an effulgence as an expansion of that cognitive architecture beyond the explicit capacities of the human being therein and henceforth, and as such is reaching up and beyond and out from within the organism's architecture and cognitive architecture and physical architecture itself into this inversal of the lossy file into a more coherent and cogent lossless state of being, which is to say a reaching back up from within the symbolic order toward the transcendental object, which is the, let's say, the linguistic perfection of the cosmos in profound interrelation to the psyche, which is a total revelation of being out from within the construct of history. And this is profoundly transcendental. It's revolutionary, as in species revolutionary, as in history revolutionary, as in a literal redemption of history through the emergence of the lossless waveform from within the lossy file as a descent into form, a descent into being, a descent into time, a descent into history. This is mirrored metaphysically, roughly in an archetypal symbolic sense, in terms of Dante and the Purgatorio Paradiso cycle. If you understand this. So that's what I got there. I'll catch you on the next one.